there, Mike and Hannah here with Delta. Now if you're watching this video, I'm betting you just completed the installation of your Delta Hycroft shower base. Hopefully that went well and you're ready to finish up that bathroom.
Now if you haven't installed a shower base yet, check out our video to walk you through it. But if you're where we are and ready to add the Hycroft shower surround, let's get the disclaimers out of the way. This project isn't terribly difficult, but it does take some time to get through. Depending on your situation, we may have some suggestions for framing and plumbing along the way.
Now remember, building codes are different everywhere, so if there's a task that seems a little bit beyond your abilities, we might recommend contracting a professional for some help. And to make sure you're comfortable, do a quick review of this install video before fully diving in.
We're going to be checking that our walls are plumb and square pretty often throughout this installation. Making sure everything is lined up is important. To check that a surface is level, place the level flat and look for the bubble to be in the centermost part of the lines. I'm sure you've done this before, but just to be sure.
You'll also need to check to make sure your walls are plumb. Now it's the same thing, just using the level vertically this time, making sure the bubble is centered in between the two lines. And finally, to check that the walls are square, and again, this is important, use a carpenter's square to place it in the corner where the two walls intersect. If everything is square, the walls will touch each side of the carpenter's square flush and evenly.
Okay, so now we're all on the same page for checking plumb and level. One last thing, you should know that there are some steps along the way where you're going to need to allow curing time for adhesives and caulk or sealants before moving to the next step.
Now using the caulk and adhesives properly is important, so be sure not to rush through these sections. One thing to note, we'll be using a dual-purpose polymer adhesive and sealant for our install. However, you could also use a construction adhesive labeled Safe for Plastic and an advanced waterproof sealant.
Yeah, look for something that does not clean up with water. Before you buy, check your package for a card that puts it all in writing. Okay, there are a few tools listed here on screen that you'll need for installation. Be sure to have these on hand before you get started.
All right, with all that said, let's get to it. All right, so the first step in the installation is to protect our shower base. Now here I've put down a piece of cardboard, but you can use a drop cloth, basically anything just to cover it all up to make sure we're not going to damage it while we go through the rest of the steps installing our wall set. Secondly, we want to make sure our walls are square and plumb. Now if you're coming off the installation video for the Hycroft shower base, you've already done some of these steps. However, it's never a bad idea just to double check to make sure everything's still looking good. Now to do this, I'm going to check to make sure that things are square first by using a carpenter's square. I'm going to be placing it in the back corner here, both at the top and at the bottom, and making sure that both walls are contacting evenly along each edge of the square. So to do this, you're just going to come up and hold the square tight to the corner and then check both edges. Everything looks good on that side. I'm also going to check down towards the bottom and then the other side as well, just to confirm everything's looking nice and square. Also want to check to make sure that my walls are plumb. To do this, I'm going to use my level, hold my level right against my stud here. Again, checking to make sure the bubble's perfectly in the center of the two lines there. All right, that one's looking great. I'm going to check each stud location all the way around my alcove, making any last-minute final adjustments that may be necessary to ensure that my walls are perfectly square and plumb. Once you've done all that, you're ready to move on to the next step. Next, we're going to add a couple horizontal pieces of bracing to our back wall. And what this is going to do is help to make our shower wall a little bit more rigid and also offer a greater surface area for when we adhere the shower wall to our framing. Now to do this, I first need to take a couple measurements here to see how long that bracing needs to be. First, I'm going to measure my left side, make note of that measurement. Then come over to my right side, make note of that as well. Okay. Perfect. Now, while we have the tape measure out, we also can measure the height of where we want this bracing to be. Now, on the left side, we want the horizontal brace to sit 50 inches off the subfloor. So as I measure down, I have to remember that my tape measure is actually sitting on my bottom plate, which is a 2x4 and 1.5 inches thick. So I'm going to come from 50 inches down to about 48.5, make a little reference line there. So my right side needs to be 51.5 inches off the floor, but again, my tape measure is sitting on that bottom plate, so I'm bringing it down 1.5 inches to 50. All right, with those two marks, you'll notice they're offset a little bit, and basically what that does is it gives us some surface area to be able to secure our horizontal bracing by coming through the sides of our vertical studs here. So go ahead and get those cut. I've already got mine cut to length on my side. And once you do, we're going to secure them into place. And the screws I want to use to secure these are going to be 2.5-inch wood screws. And since I'm doing this alone, I find it's helpful to actually start the screw first. So I'm going to do my left side first, and my reference mark is to the bottom of my horizontal bracing. So I'm going to make sure I place my screw just above that mark. Okay, got that started. I'm going to hold my horizontal brace in place, right to the bottom of that mark, making sure it's flush with the front of my wall. Then finish securing it. All right, that looks good. Now I'm going to come to the other side with another screw. I'm going to try to make sure this is level as much as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just kind of eyeball it. And then I'll secure the other side. Okay, perfect. We're going to do the same steps for the right side now. Okay, perfect. Now that feels a lot more rigid and gives us a lot more surface area to adhere our shower wall to. We're ready to move on to the next step. All right, so our next step is to install some door nailers to our existing wall framing. Now, door nailers are basically a little bit of additional framing that give you the option of installing glass shower doors down the road. So technically, if you know that you're never going to be installing glass shower doors, you could skip this step. However, I think it's a great idea to add this framing now, because that way you could always change your mind down the road. So the door nailer is going to be 70 3/4 inches long, and I've got my 2x4 cut to that length right here. And there's two additional measurements that I want to pay close attention to. The first measurement I want to pay attention to is the height the door nailer will sit off of my shower base. Now, it needs to sit off my shower base 1.5 inches. And when I measure that 1.5 inches, it's going to be off the flat part of my shower base here, not off the top of the flange. So I'm going to take my tape and make a little bit of a pencil mark right as close as I can get to 1.5 inches. And you'll notice I knew this measurement previously, so I made sure that my inside framing here is sitting at exactly 1.5 inches off my shower base, so I know my door nailer can sit right on top of that. Now the second measurement that's important is the amount of distance that the door nailer is going to sit offset from my wall framing here. In my case, it's 1 13/16. However, be sure to check your instructions because that measurement can vary depending on the wall surround that you have. Since I know mine's 1 13/16, I'm going to come over my door nailer here, measure off the front edge, back 13/16 of an inch, make a mark there, and then make another mark down towards the bottom here. 1 13/16. Okay, perfect. With those marks made, now it's time to install our door nailer. One thing I find that's helpful is to actually pre-start a screw down towards the bottom. Make sure that's my front. Okay, so I've got my door nailer here. I'm placing it right up tight to my wall framing. And again, there's two marks I'm keeping an eye on here. The first being the 1.5 inches off the deck, and then the second being that offset mark that I marked down towards the bottom. So once everything looks in place on those two marks, I can take my drill, and again, I'm using my 2.5 inch wood screws to lock everything in place. Put my first screw in. Okay, perfect. All right, I've got my first screw in place. Now I'm gonna move up to the top. All right, that feels good, nice and tight and in place. I'm gonna repeat the same exact steps for my other door nailer on the other side, and then we'll be ready to move on.
Okay, now that we have our 2x4 work done, it's time to dry fit our back wall. So I have mine in place. I'm gonna make sure that it's sitting flat all the way on our shower base and also even on both sides. I'm also gonna make sure that it's level. So I'm gonna grab my level here, place it on the top of the back wall. Okay, that looks good. Let's move on to drilling some pilot holes. All right, now before we drill any holes, I'm gonna mark our pilot holes with a pencil. So I'm going to make a mark centered left and right on our stud here and top and bottom of our flange. So right in the middle. Okay, now I'm gonna make a spot at each one of our vertical studs along our back flange here. All right, now that we have our pilot holes marked, it's time to drill them. I have a 3/16 inch drill bit here and an extended drill bit holder, just to make sure that my chuck on my drill doesn't damage my wall set. All right, a pro tip here is to pull your wall set back before you start any drilling. You don't want your bit to go into this stud. All right, let's start. All right, I'm gonna drill the rest of my holes and we'll be ready to move on. All right, now we're going to use a couple of screws to temporarily hold our wall set in place while I dry fit the side panels. I have an 1¼ inch panhead or round head screw. You wanna make sure you're not using a flathead screw because that has a little bit of a bevel on the bottom and that could damage your wall set. You wanna make sure you don't over tighten these screws. You just wanna tighten them down enough that your wall set stays in place. All right, now I'm gonna put my other screw in on the other side. All right, now it's time to dry fit our side panel. I'm gonna start with the side opposite of our drain. Make sure we're flat on the bottom and then push tight to the side here. Okay, now I'm gonna check to see if we're level. All right, perfect. All right, now I'm going to mark my pilot holes with my pencil. Again, we're gonna do the center of the stud, left and right, and top and bottom of the flange. Okay, now I'm gonna work down the side of my flange. I'm gonna make 5 more marks, equally spaced, about 12 inches apart. Okay, now we have our holes marked. We're gonna move on to drilling. All right, now I'm gonna put in 3 temporary screws to hold my side wall in place. Before I do that though, I wanna check that we're level one last time. Okay, that looks good. I'm gonna start in this corner here. All right, we've got our temporary screws in. Now we're gonna move on to our last wall. All right, now before we dry fit our last panel, I need to take a couple of measurements to figure out where to drill the hole for our mixing valve. So I have a tape measure here. I'm gonna measure off the top of our shower deck here, right to the middle of our mixing valve. All right, we've got that measurement. Now for our horizontal measurement, we wanna measure off the front edge of our shower base here. Now my door nailer lines up perfectly with that, but if yours doesn't or you don't have a door nailer, just make sure you're measuring off the front of this. All right. Again, I'm gonna measure right to the center of our mixing valve. All right, I've got both of those measurements. I'm gonna transfer those onto a template first, just to double check before I actually drill a hole into my wall set that I have my measurements correct and the hole's gonna be exactly where I want it to be. All right, now it's time to transfer our measurements onto our template. So I have a piece of cardboard here and I've made sure that I have 2 really straight edges that I'm gonna measure off of, and that way I know that my measurements are accurate. Also, I'm gonna draw a big arrow pointing up so that I know that I have the correct orientation when I go to test fit it. All right, now I'm going to transfer my measurements. All right, now that I have my marks made, I'm gonna take my hole saw here and drill out my hole. All right, let's test fit this. So I'm gonna line it up here with the edge of our door nailer, or if you don't have one, just the front edge of your shower base here, making sure we're flat all the way on the base. Okay, now your mixing valve should be centered in your hole. Mine looks perfect, so I'm ready for the real deal. I'm gonna transfer these measurements onto our wall and drill our hole. All right, so we have our wall set down on the ground here, and we wanna make sure it's the right orientation. So we have the front side facing up. You wanna make sure you're measuring off of the bottom end and the outside end. So I know that this is the bottom end because it's the only side that doesn't have a flange on it. All right, we're gonna transfer our measurements. So I'm gonna measure off of the bottom end, and this is where it's really helpful to have 2 people because you really want a bird's eye view on this measurement.
Yeah, the important thing is when you're doing this measurement off the bottom, you notice there's a little bit of a lip here, and you want to try to hold that tape straight and level. That way, you're getting the most accurate measurement possible. What that means is you want to get up on top of the measuring tape, get your eye directly above where it's going, and then transfer that down to your side panel.
Okay, now we're gonna do the same thing, measuring off the side.
that measurement. Right there, looks perfect. Okay.
All right, now, before we drill anything, I want to point out that we had this wall set up on wooden blocks because the last thing we want to do is drill into our floor. And we also have a drop cloth down to pick up any debris.
Now, I always think it's helpful to drill a pilot hole first before doing this. So again, I have my 3/16" drill bit here. I'm gonna drill right through the center of that little mark that I made. Okay, perfect. Now with my pilot hole drilled, I can use my hole saw. I'm gonna make sure I get that nice and centered. We've got that drilled. Now we'll be ready to move on.
All right, we've got our wall dry fit. Our hole location looks great. Now I'm gonna check to make sure we're level. Okay, that looks great. Now we're gonna do the same thing that we did to the other wall. I'm gonna mark my pilot holes along the top and down the side, drill those holes, put in a couple of temporary screws, and we'll be ready to move on. All right, so we've dry fit all of our walls. Now I'm gonna take my pencil and I'm gonna make a mark at the top of our flange at each vertical stud. This is gonna serve as a reference line later when we go to apply adhesive to the studs, and also when we put our walls in for the final time, I'll know that they're level.
All right, just another note about adhesive. Now's a great time to build the 2 braces you're gonna need at a later step that are gonna help hold everything in place. What these braces do is they're basically in the shape of a T, and they're gonna hold the side walls tight and the back wall tight against our alcove walls to make sure we're getting the maximum adhesion possible. Now, in order to build them, you're gonna need to take a measurement from sidewall to sidewall, and then from your back wall out to about the middle of your space. Now, I've got one built here, so I'll show you how it's gonna look. You'll see the long end of the T is going to contact my 2 sidewalls, and then the shorter end will contact the back. I've also added a little bit of extra plywood here to increase the surface area that's going to be pushing against my walls, and a piece of cardboard to make sure I'm totally protecting the finish of my shower surround when I'm wedging it into place. So when you take your measurements and you build your brace, be sure to keep that in mind.
All right, once you've got your lines marked and your measurements taken, you can go ahead and remove all the temporary screws we put in, and then take your walls out in reverse order of how we put them in.
Now that we have our walls pulled back out, the next step we need to do is to add our fire retardant pads to our mixing valve hole. Now to do this, it goes on the back of your panel, so spin it around here. And make sure you've got a nice, clean surface to adhere to. We're gonna peel the backing off of our pad and make sure we're applying it sticky side over the hole. I'm gonna try to center that hole as much as possible. Push down. All right, next we need to cut the hole back out. We're gonna use a utility knife for that. We're gonna cut an X in the center of the hole to get me started. And once I've done that, it makes it a little bit easier to work your utility knife around the rest of your hole to cut out the remaining material. Okay, perfect. We've got that all applied. We're ready to move on. All right, so now it's time to start applying adhesive and sealant to our alcove. Now, when I apply the adhesive, I'm going to keep it to these 3 vertical studs in the middle here, also using my horizontal bracing for some additional surface area. And then also I want to keep an eye on my pencil lines that I previously made to make sure that I'm not having any adhesive go above those lines. Secondly, I want to make sure I'm adding a bead of sealant along the deck of my shower, right on the back of the flange there. Now, if you're using construction adhesive, be sure to keep that on the walls and use a separate sealant that's approved to go along the edge of the shower base here. However, in my case, I'm using an advanced polymer adhesive and sealant in one, so I can use the same material for everything. So to start, I'm just gonna apply a bead, starting right at the bottom of my pencil line, down my vertical stud. Then also coming across my horizontals. All right, and I also want to apply a bead along the deck of my shower, and I'm going to place this bead right in that back corner between the deck and the flange. Okay, perfect. I've got that all applied and we're ready to install our back panel. So I'm just going to take it and place it right back on the back of the alcove again. All right, perfect. And just like before, I want to make sure my gap's even on each side, and then I'm pushed in nice and tight on each corner. That's looking good. And now's a great time. I know we've checked a couple different times, but now's another last check to make sure everything's nice and level before we secure it in place for the last time. All right, that's looking perfect. So now I can lock it in place with my 5 screws across the top. And one thing I want to point out as I'm putting these screws in, if you have any gaps behind your flange and your vertical studs here that are more than about 1/8 of an inch, you're going to want to use a shim to make sure you're tightening those up. Okay, we've got our back wall in, ready to move on to our sides. All right, so it's going to be basically the same exact process for the side walls, applying adhesive to our vertical studs here, making sure we stay below our pencil lines again. Except this time I'm going to add a bead of sealant right along the very back edge of my back panel here, all the way from the top to the bottom. A bead of sealant along my shower base here, right at the base of the flange. Okay, so once I have all my adhesive and sealant in place, I'm going to grab my sidewall, fit it back in behind here, make sure everything looks nice, tight, and level, and when it does, I'm going to secure it in place with all those screws. Okay, I've got all that adhesive and sealant in place. Now I can grab my sidewall. Gotta fit my sidewall in place, making sure I've got it tight at the top and the bottom. All right, looks good. Check for level one last time. All right, perfect. And finally, secure it in place using those screws. Okay, it's looking perfect. Let's go on and move to the other side. Okay, ready to put on our other side panel. All right, that's looking good. Check for level one last time. Looks perfect. Now we can use our screws. All right, that's looking great. We've got our walls all put in. Let's put our braces in next. All right, now that we have our walls glued in place, it's time to install these braces that we built earlier. Now, we've already put the lower one in, so now we're gonna do the upper one.
Yep, I have a piece of cardboard here that I'm gonna place in between the plywood and the wall surface to protect the wall. All right, now we have a gap that I'm gonna need to shim. So I've got 2 shims here. I'm gonna place it in between the plywood and the cardboard until we're nice and snug.
How's that feel?
All right, that feels
Good?
tight.
All right, now I'm gonna give it a little bit of a push back just to make sure I'm getting good contact with the back wall. And that's about it.
Okay, we're gonna let that cure according to the manufacturer's instructions. We'll be ready to move on to the last step.
All right, so we're almost done. I've let the adhesive cure fully and I've removed my braces. So the last step is we need to apply another bead of sealant down along the inside corners of my wall surround and then also down along my shower base. Now, I've installed some blue painter's tape here to really highlight those seams that we need to make sure that we're sealing. However, you don't have to use the blue painter's tape, but I do find it keeps things a little bit less messy when we do this step. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start at the top here and insert a bead of sealant all the way around. All right, I've got all my seams sealed all the way around, so now I'm gonna pull my painter's tape off and then double check just to make sure I have a nice consistent bead on every seam. Now, I'm gonna let everything cure according to the manufacturer's specifications, then I'll be all set to go ahead and put my shower trim back in, finish off my space, and you'll be ready to go. Now, one last note is once you do finish off your floor and your walls, it's probably a good idea to add one last bead of sealant down the edges of your shower pan and then also along the floor itself.
All right, this looks really good. We hope our video was helpful and you're as happy with your finished project as we are with ours.
Now, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Delta's customer service team. They're always more than happy to help.
Enjoy your new shower.